is with the Lord, and I invite you to turn in your notes to page 15. To have a little bit of an outline of where we're going to be. And now here's the thing. I have to curb my enthusiasm a bit here because the first 2 points of this are some things that I spent some time with my doctor of ministry talking about, and that is arguments for the existence of God and evidence for God, and revealing that we have good reasons to believe that not only there is a God, but that He is who He says He is in Scripture. And so this is the stuff that I get really excited about, but so that means I can get long-winded on, and I'm not going to do that tonight. But let it be just a foretaste of what we're going to talk about, and something of a foundation of hopefully things and conversations we can have later about, because it really does all begin with God. I mean, it truly does. So often in life, we treat God or faith as sort of one piece of the pie of our life. We've got our church and faith life here. We've got our work life here. But if we're going to take seriously that God has created everything, if He is truly the author of not only life but existence itself, if we're going to take seriously the problem of sin and the way that God answers that, then we have to recognize truly, it all does come back to God. Every bit of it. It's not just a slice of life. It's really meant to be all about that, all about Him. But if we're going to talk about God, then you do at least have to lay some kind of case for, is there a God? Because right now, in Western culture in particular, there's a lot of questions about that. There are perhaps more questions than there has been. The question about, is there a God? And really, perhaps even the bigger question, and the question that I think probably keeps people from faith, how do you know? How do you know? How is God more than simply a religious preference? How is God, if there is a God, isn't He or she or it too big for us to comprehend? And if that's true, how can we make any kind of assertive claims about God Himself? Even my 9-year-old, when we were driving down the road, has already asked me, but God, how do we know our God's the real God? This is a pervasive question, and it's a question that keeps people from getting to know God as He truly is, because of what feels like a humility of like, well, we can't know, He's too big, so I'm just going to hold loosely to all that. And certainly there is mystery involved, to be sure. But is there a sense that God has actually revealed Himself? And if He has revealed Himself, can't we know? Can't we know? So I want to just, again, very, very quickly lay out why I think we can know. One, that there is a God, and that we can trust that He is who He says He is. And the first thing that I mentioned there is the statement under, and again, this is point 1, the existence of God. Just to state that the question actually matters. That it is a question that is more than just a slice of life. It's not just a matter of preference. That if there's a God, it matters. It matters big time. Because if there isn't a God, then there's a really good chance that nothing means anything whatsoever. That even the meaning that we seek to stir up in our own lives probably is really nothing more than just a cursory fancy on an ultimate scale. Even if it is very important to us, if there is no God, then there's a good chance there's no meaning, there's no true right and wrong, there's no history's not going anywhere, and all of this is ultimately pointless. But one of my professors tells the story of a fictitious person named Juan Mug, and Juan Mug is an idiot who gets to college, and he goes to science class because every college student has to take some kind of science class, and the science department decides to play a trick on him and say, we are going to pretend like Juan Mug is the most intelligent, bright, articulate student we've ever seen. And so all the professors get in on it. They even get the students in on it, so that whenever Juan Mug asks a question, or this says, the professor says, we're going to just pretend like he's asked a question nobody's ever asked before. It's like, wow, that's incredible. We've never thought about that. And so they pass all of his tests. He graduates, summa cum laude, and he goes and gets a graduate program. They get in on the lie. And so he gets passed through just as this gigantic prank. He goes on into the world and writes these articles that are just, they're completely foolishness. But everybody treats him like he is the smartest, most intelligent thing that has ever come to science. He wins awards, he makes lots of money, he publishes books, and so the question is, do we envy Wanmugh? The reality is we would look at Wanmugh and say, no, we don't want to be him, because there's something at the core of his life. He might believe he's got everything that he could ever want and more. And you know what? Maybe living in a dream world is perfectly fine. But for us who sees that, we would say, no, that's hollow. That's shallow. It's empty. It's not a true life. And so the question matters. What is life meant to be? And so the source of the answer to that question matters. So the question, is there a real, true, good life to be lived? And that we need to have true beliefs about what life is really meant to be about. So just another illustration here. Let me ask you a question. And it's not a fair question, I'm sorry to say. Take a guess as to what my mother looks like. Like what we could do, we could actually, put up a chart here and catalog your answers and see which one is right and which one's wrong. The reality though is there is a right answer, isn't there? My mom has a certain height. She has a certain eye color. She has a certain stature. We could talk about her personality. Is she dour? Is she upbeat? And the reality is there is a true answer, isn't there? Now, who's the authority in the room on my mother? I am, right? Because she's my mother, and I know her. But what we have to recognize is we are talking about an actual person, and there is a true answer to the question. And there are different sources of knowledge about the true answer to that question in this room, and one of them is closer than the other. We could go around it, and there'd be competing answers to that, right? Same with God, right? Just because we have competing answers doesn't mean there isn't somebody who's closer to the way things actually are. So we have to recognize that not all sources of information about who God is are equal. What we also discover is that in human beings themselves, it's not enough. It's not enough for us to simply be the source of that knowledge. So, for example, what you tend to find in modern culture today is it's interesting because studies continue to show that people are as interested in spirituality, and maybe even more so than they have ever been. But what's interesting about that spirituality, when you start to dig down into it, is it doesn't conform to any one simple picture of a religious life. Like you might think of the traditional categories of Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist. But particularly in Western culture, or say you go down to Black Mountain, you're going to talk to somebody and ask them about their spirituality. And they may have some things that sound an awful lot like Jesus, but then they have some things that sound pretty Buddhist. But they've got also a little sprinkling of Zen over here, and then some Hindu New Age kind of understandings of the self and chakras and energy and things like that. And so suddenly what you find is what is called the smorgasbord effect. That people are creating a spirit, they've got their plate, and they're saying, I like a little Jesus here, but I don't like that part of him, so I'm going to leave that behind, and I'm going to take a little Buddhism here and put that on my plate. And what you suddenly find is you've got a plate filled with everything that you like. What's the problem with that? I think the problem is that you get all the foods you like, and you get none of the stuff you don't like. So suddenly you've got a religion in your own image. You've got a God who looks and votes and likes the things that you do. And you have something that doesn't challenge you or ask you to change or to adjust. There's no challenge to be a better person. So again, just to recap, we all have this sense that life should matter. And that it should somehow be attached to the way things actually are. That the things that we're pursuing and the things we're about truly are important and that matter. That all sources of information for that are not equal. That We need more than ourselves for the source of this knowledge, because otherwise we're just going to fill the plate with things we like, and we're going to avoid the things we don't. And again, we avoid change. We're not asked to truly change, and we actually don't get to the way things actually are. But again, we have to acknowledge that if there is a God, this question matters, because this is the same being, the same person, and I mean person not as like a human being person, but an entity with a free-thinking, intelligent entity that interacts, that it has a relationship. That if this kind of God created the world, this God also then knows how the world should work, what's good and bad, what's worthwhile and what's corrupt. And so we should know. It's of ultimate importance. So the question is then, how do we know that there is a God? If this question matters, and that's what point 1 is ultimately getting at, then what are the cases for that? And throughout philosophy and theology, there have been this journey, this quest to discover what's the evidence that we have that there is something more to this. And so the question is, what's the evidence? And the first bit of evidence is what's called the cosmological argument. And again, we're not going to get to do any of these justice. We're just kind of skating through here. And that is simply to argue the universe had a beginning. That we live in a closed cause and effect universe. You think about the billiard ball, right? The cue hits the cue ball at a certain amount of force at a certain angle, which causes the cue ball then to go and hit the other ball at a certain angle, which will then cause the ball to fall into the pocket, and gravity taking over and making it fall. And what we recognize is that if all of those things are equal, the amount of force, the amount of spin, the angle of attack from one ball to the next, the force of gravity, if all of those remain equal, then if we do that again, it's going to happen again. Cause and effect, repeatable, and this is what science is based upon, this ability to repeat these kinds of things. So if that is true, if everything in life is kind of cause to effect, cause to effect, cause to effect, something had to start the dominoes falling, right? There's no evidence anywhere in creation of something happening without a cause. Even on a quantum level, when you can really start to blow your mind here. There are arguments made that there are things happening spontaneously, but most physicists will tell you it's not that things are happening spontaneously. We just haven't figured out what's causing them yet. So if that is the case, then something had to get it all started. If there is no true spontaneous act within a closed system of creation, then something outside of that system had to start the dominoes falling. And the most logical the cleanest answer to that is that there is an intelligent being that started it outside of the closed system. Intelligent because there's an intentionality to it, there's an order to it, that sort of thing. But there is a first cause. Secondly is what's called the teleological argument, which gets at sort of the vast complexity of the universe, the ability for life to be sustaining. That there is sort of an order to the universe, that there are constants in the universe, that forces between atoms are constant, that the force of gravity remains constant, that there is this kind of vast complexity that is interconnected to perpetuate life. The reality is that wouldn't happen on accident. So in other words, it's not simply a matter that there is an entity outside of the system that has all the ingredients. It's that this entity took all the ingredients and put them together. Another way to think about it is, if you were to lay all the parts of a Boeing 747 on a field and a tornado were to whip through, what's the likelihood of all the parts coming together to form a 747? It's infinitesimally, it's absurdly tiny, right? To the point that, again, the most logical explanation then is there was an intelligence driving not only the beginning of the universe, but in the bringing together and the fine-tuning of the universe. There's an interesting argument for this too. Have you ever heard of SETI? In fact, they were in the news recently. SETI is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. You ever see the movie Contact with Jodie Foster. Great movie, by the way. SETI is an actual kind of movement, and it's been around for 20 years or so across the globe, of scientists who basically, when they're not using their instruments to look at the star or the planet or the thing that they're looking at the sky, they're allowing their equipment to be used to look for signals for extraterrestrial intelligence. And what do you think they're looking for? They're looking for radio signals that have patterns that cannot be accidental, or that cannot be naturally causing. So in the movie Contact, SETI, they actually, it's a true organization, but in the movie they're used as a place to, they say they hear the signal and they get a signal of prime numbers, which can't be accidental, and so they infer, oh, there's an intelligence, and of course the movie's all about them, the world kind of going in an uproar. We found extraterrestrial life. So the reality is, you're looking for a signal that is sufficiently, that is not random, that is not, because binary stars and planets and all these things put off certain signals and wavelengths and things like that, but you're looking for something that has a certain complexity to it that cannot be just purely accident, but happen because of an intelligence. You think about like a Morse code, like it's not just dots. There's a message being conveyed in that. What's fascinating is when you look at a DNA strand, what you find is a highly complex, highly ordered, highly meaning pattern. That to say that happened by accident becomes, again, an absurdly minuscule likelihood. And again, the more reasonable explanation, there is an author behind the signal or the information strand behind a DNA. So it's like, whoa. All right, well, what other evidence is there? Man has a conscience. Man and women have a sense of right and wrong, generally speaking. You don't have to teach somebody that rape is wrong or that murder is wrong. Now, we might have different understandings about it. We may not articulate it the same. We may have different consequences for those acts. But or one of the illustrations my professor would use is like, we all know that bashing a baby is wrong. Bashing a baby in the head is wrong. Like, we don't have to be told that. But why? What is it about us? Is it purely a survival instinct? And yeah, we have a sense of right and wrong. I have, again, this atheist buddy that I might have mentioned last time, who was just saying, like, I don't need God to tell me right and wrong. I just know inside of me what's right and what's wrong. And I'm just like, but why? Is that just an accident? But the reality is that we all have this sense, or the way C.S. Lewis puts it at the beginning of Mere Christianity, he says, if you see someone drowning in a lake, there are three things that stand in front of you: a choice to save the person and risk your own life, a choice to preserve your life and to not do anything, and an impulse that is saying which one is the right one to do. And he says, where does that impulse to say, I should try to rescue the person, what does that come from? And the argument being is that if we have a sense of right and wrong, there had to be if there's a moral law in us, there had to be a lawgiver. And again, the most logical explanation being there is a God. There is an entity outside of that who has imparted something of itself, its sense of moral value into its creation. And then finally, kind of closely related, is a value giver. It's amazing how innate it is to say that human life matters. You think about somebody who is passionate about racism but doesn't believe in God. They have this sense that life matters and that we shouldn't treat each other wrongly because of that. Or we all have this innate sense that our life should mean something, that our life is meant for something, that we want our lives to matter. And maybe when we say we want our lives to matter, we don't mean I'm going to be the next president, or I'm going to be the most wealthy person ever lived, or I'm going to invent the cure to cancer, although, Nothing wrong with that. But maybe it's just I want to have a good, happy life with a healthy family that I raise with my spouse and happily ever after. That's another way of saying I want my life to matter, that I want my parenting to influence the child. Why? Why do we want our lives to matter? And it's because our lives actually matter. That it's not simply that a culture has said lives matter because we say it does, or that my life matters because I think it does. Maybe it actually matters. Maybe human life actually has priceless value, not simply because we say it does. Does that make sense? Does that distinction make sense? So if it does, if there is intrinsic value, then where does it come from? It has to come from outside of the system. And the most logical explanation is that there is a value giver that has said, this has value. Again, something outside of that system. So again, what we find is that to me, no one of those things by itself would lead you to the Christian God per se, but it would lead you to the belief that there is more, and that there is a God. The most simple explanation, there is a God, not many gods, and that this God is good because He has imputed value and purpose and a sense of right in human life, in the people that He's created.